You are now listening to the Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network.
Hello there, and welcome back.
What is this place?
Disconnected.
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 I've reached a number that has been disconnected.
Hello there, and welcome back to the Disconnected, here with the one of the more interesting individuals that I've been excited to talk about for a while here. We've got the writer, editor, and disability advocate, Kristen Lopez. Kristen, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
You've got a couple books coming out in the next couple of years that we're going to be talking about in just a little bit, but you've written a book before, and when somebody hears disability advocate and that's connected to film, I wonder how many people even know what exactly that means. So why don't you share what that means for people?
I talk about disability predominantly from the film representation side, which I think a lot of people assume, disability advocates are government-based or, right. social justice type of stuff, that they're all crusading for, more curb cuts and, legislation, which is important. Those people, I applaud them. I love that they do the work that they do. I knew I was never going to be that. But at the same time, as one of the few, if not only physically disabled critics that I knew, that I still I still don't see any wheelchair users at any of the screenings that I go to that are at the same level writing wise as me or, that work in the trade. So, right. I knew I was kind of in a privileged position to be like, oh, okay, well then I can talk about entertainment from a disability perspective and kind of ask questions about why things are the way they are. And I figured that would just be some sort of fun little niche that maybe I could make money. Like people would want to be like, oh, this girl is going to write an article that's going to get 1,000 clicks and, we want to work with her. But I started noticing that people that were disabled and non-disabled people as well were reading it and were either heartened that somebody understood, their issues with film, or B, did not know that certain depictions were problematic and right. We're happy about that because ableism is still a relatively new ism, right? We don't really know when we're doing it, and we certainly don't look back at the history of film in a way that emphasizes, if you look at film through the lens of like racism, you understand that film is part of the culture of oppression. So the right. history of film is one of, racism and trying to move away from that. And same with disability. A lot of it is emphasizing disability is a negative, and we're having to unlearn that at this point. And it's still a relatively new thing. So for me, I always tell people I'm not shitting on your love of a certain movie. I love many a problematic disabled film.
Right.
It's about telling you that you should look closer though at why things are the way they are. Why is the main character who is disabled a white guy? Why are most disabled characters disabled late in life? Why are disabled characters that are, physically disabled, especially women, also tied into how sexually attractive they are or aren't? All of these things are deliberate choices that come from just a history of ableism.
Well, and many of the things that you've talked about in this sector online previously and in your work are related to things of that last portion. There's things like the pretty disabled and the films that are out there that we are capturing, just the most surface level of disabilities, I guess is the best way to say this. Like, we can talk about people that are deaf because that's something that we can relate to. But in a world of recognizing the full spectrum of all of this, it is really hard to even discuss because in a lot of ways, and pardon the pun with what you just said, but this is just not really a sexy topic either. This isn't something that gets a lot of clicks. This isn't something that sells a ton of tickets to things. People aren't dying to go to the films to see this. But the reality is, it's important for those that would be represented on screen.
Well, I think the fact that it's not a sexy topic is that history of right. saying it's not a sexy topic. unfortunately, there's been movies that have dealt with disability and sexuality, and people don't go see those movies. Why? I say often it has more to do with the audience than the film per se, because I think I think abled audiences, because that's, remember, what I think most movies are made for. Most movies about disability are trying to get disabled audiences, not able people. So I think that, a lot of times people just kind of don't go see those movies because they're uncomfortable with it.
Right.
I mean, there have been movies that have tried to change the game. Coda won an Oscar, but that movie did not make a lot of money, when it did go to the theater. So what is the issue? Is it that people just automatically assume that a disabled movie is some sort of Oscar baity serious thing that's the equivalent of taking your medicine, and I think that we really need to revise what that is. At the same time, I think that I always couch disabled narratives in the sense of, are they about ambulatory disabled people or not? Because I think that, what's interesting is I get asked a lot, about why don't I talk about invisible disabilities? Right. And I always say, I can only research from my experience, from my perspective, and apply it. I don't have autism, as far as I know. I have ADHD, but I personally don't consider that a disability for myself. So I don't really know how to couch it in those terms, just because I'm not built with that knowledge. And at the same time, I think my point still stands, which is that invisible disabilities continue to be the way around dealing with disability in film. Again, a director, a screenwriter can write a physically abled hot girl who maybe has, some sort of invisible disability. Right. It doesn't solve the problem, because, again, it's still just another way to X out having to make the industry accessible for all.
Well, and that leads into why there needs to be a book about this, which you have coming out. I mean, the moment that you let me know that this existed, I had to pre-order this, because this has been something I've been trying to talk about for a while, trying to get people to understand is an important topic, try to have people understand what representation can be. So tell us about your book.
Popcorn Disabilities is my attempt to kind of do a look at disability in film in a way that's not academic. It's being put out by an academic press, but I really wanted it to be funny, and kind of utilizing things that I've learned from watching disabled films. How disabled films made me feel as a person, and how I'm assuming they make a lot of other people feel because of the bad representation. So, it was an interesting journey historically from the silent era to today, looking at disabled films and the tropes and the stereotypes they use, but more importantly, how they make a generation of disabled people feel about being disabled. Right.
There's so many people, obviously, that have probably never even considered this while watching many of these films. With that in mind, and obviously we could get you to speak on this for hours and hours, but with that in mind, can you explain what is good representation and bad representation of disabilities?
I mean, the most obvious is bad representation, because there's more of that exists. And mostly it's emphasizing that becoming disabled is something to fear, that becoming disabled is a death sentence, and or that you're lacking in something, and that a disabled person is always mourning what they have lost. And usually bad representation is, showing that being disabled, you're something to pity, you're poor, you're uneducated, your family hates you, you hate yourself. All of these elements that emphasize, at the end of the movie, it's all about the able person. So, how the able person feels having known you. Your life doesn't need to get better, but it's about how the other person that really spends time with you, that deigns to be your friend or partner or whatever, how their life is better. Good representation, I think, for me, in terms of what I look at right now, is if it gets the little things right. If if it's showing me a person in a wheelchair that is a custom chair and not a hospital chair. If I can tell that that person in that wheelchair has actually used a wheelchair or has done some sort of research. If the script doesn't emphasize that disability is something to be sad about, it just exists. It's just something to be happy about. If a movie is about a disabled woman, particularly disabled woman of color, I will give it at least a kudo for not being a typical, white male disabled story. So, good representation, I think right now is still coming in bits and pieces as opposed to an overarching thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's a kind of baseline Bechdel test sort of feeling that you can get here, and it seems like if somebody with a disability is in a scene and that's the only focus of every scene, that's pretty damn telling in and of itself.
Exactly, yeah, and I mean, there's so many overt elements I think that people don't notice about disability representation. I mean, one of them is how often a disabled movie prioritizes an abled person, whether that's a caregiver or a partner. The movie's not really the disabled person's story, it's the partner's story.
They're the ones falling in love or something.
Yeah, Rain Man is a great example. Dustin Hoffman is on the poster, yes, and he is the titled character. And yet, I think most people, if you ask them who is the protagonist, who is the lead, who is the person that grows and changes, it's Tom Cruise. And that happens a lot because, screenwriters and I think entertainment executives, the whole group, assume that disabled people are this magical entity that you're clearly not going to understand as an audience member. So we need to have what I call an able-bodied buffer, which is an able person that can be the Sherpa, that can help you understand the mythical disabled person. They're really telling the audience that we think you're stupid, and I think that's always really funny to me, that when people realize like, oh, wow, that's really true.
I guess we all need an ambassador to disabled land. That's for sure.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, I think that I'm one of the few people that, I tell people we compartmentalize. If I was looking for a movie that was perfectly rendered from a disabled standpoint, I would not like anything because it just doesn't exist. And, I love me some bad representation that maybe has some merit. I love Forrest Gump. I think that movie is really interesting, specifically for the Gary Sinise character. And yet, it's got a lot of issues. So I think that we all kind of have to see the good where we can, when we can.
I would agree there. With that, there are lots of obvious bad examples of this. What are some of the more, we'll say, recent films that people should look to as good indicators of disability representation in film?
It's tough. I mean, I always say the horror genre is one of the more accommodating disabled, genres, if only because there's more characters there, either overtly disabled or coded as such. I tell people I love Aaron Schimberg's A Different Man, which came out last year. I think that's one of the best looks at disabled representation, and yet disabled people and abled audiences don't necessarily think of that. I know a lot of disabled people that when I said how much I loved the movie, they had not seen it, but they had seen that Sebastian Stan was playing a disabled character, and they said, oh, well, what do you mean? He's a disabled character that gets hot. And I was like, no, you clearly have not seen the film. I'm like, because it's commenting very specifically on the belief that all disabled people want to be hot Sebastian Stan. Yep. And that is only scratching the surface. It's got so many different layers to it in terms of, the magic cure and how often disabled people want that. It even goes so far as to get a little meta and asks the question of whether Aaron Schimberg himself has any right to be telling a disabled story. It's very smart. It's very smart, and I love it. I love it so very much. I think Coda is very sweet. I think it's great to see a disabled family that's not wealthy, or at least is not financially solvent, which tends to be something that you see a lot of. And I always point to the Chucky films, specifically Don Mancini's latter two, Curse and Cult of Chucky, which have a disabled heroine. Yes, Fiona Dorff is not disabled, but I've been fortunate to interview Don Mancini about it and to hear him talk about like trying to get in the weeds of like discovering the right custom chair, you know, and you know, I think I gave him guff when I interviewed him. I'm like, well, you know, the movie's great. I love it. I don't have a lot of criticisms. I'm all, but, you know, Fiona, when she's wheeling that chair, she's got chicken arms. You know, she's got these flapping wings. I'm all, a disabled person, especially one that's got like hardwood floor, you propel off of stuff. You know, you're trying to work smarter, not harder. Yeah. And he was like, yeah, that's fair. That's fair. But I mean, the movie, I think, is really smart in how it has a disabled heroine, disabled from birth. You can argue whether that is true or not based on if you've seen the movie, the plot point. I don't want to spoil it. But she's disabled from birth. She's a sexual character. Everybody else around her is a dick because they make the presumption that she's not capable, and yet she clearly is. And she uses her disability in a way that's always an advantage. So I think those are the ones that I always say I really love. If you go even further back to something like the silent era, there's a 1920s film from Lon Chaney Sr. called The Penalty, which is hilariously bonkers. It's hilarious. So the plot, the beginning of the movie in a nutshell, is that a doctor is operating on a child who is going to grow up to be Lon Chaney Sr. The kid's got a cold and a bump on the head. And the doctor is like, gotta chop his legs off. Like, that's what we gotta do. That's what we gotta do. And he does. And he makes this character a double amputee. And just from a technical standpoint, I don't know how they did it in this movie, hiding Lon Chaney's legs. I know they did. They've talked about how he did like this weird contraption where he strapped his legs behind him.
Wow.
I don't know how they did it. I have no clue. It looks like he does not have any legs below the knee. But to watch, and just the production design, the way that ramps are kind of like intricately added into the set design. He's like trying to like see through out a door window, and he's got little like pegs that he puts in these holes and like climbs the wall like he's Spider-Man. But the story is also like, you understand this guy becoming a criminal mastermind and wanting to take vengeance on the doctor, right? Because, dude, that is some serious malpractice. Is it good representation? I'm not really sure, but is it an entertaining as hell movie that is really cool to watch? You are damn right it is. This is a perfect segue because of what you just brought up. You have frequently spoken about the landmark film Freaks over the years because it is widely discussed as, depending on who you're speaking with, either incredibly controversial for being exploitive for certain people, and then on the far other end of the spectrum, incredibly accepting for allowing these people to be on the screen at the time. What are, other than Freaks, and perhaps you can start with Freaks, what are some of the major touch points in film history of disability representation? Freaks is one of those. It's one of the few movies that even now, in 2025, it still holds the record for the most abled cast members, on screen at any point in time. We've not broken that yet. It's one of those films that is just amazing to see how many physically disabled people are present that have really no shame in it. That just exist. Todd Browning tried really hard to humanize these characters and humanize the actors as well, to hear some of the behind the scenes stories about how people treated these performers is just, you hate F. Scott Fitzgerald by the end of it because you're just like, come on. It's heartbreaking how it's a film that didn't single-handedly destroy Todd Browning's career, but it certainly didn't help. And it's a fantastic movie.
It's really great. Yeah. It's one, Todd Browning and actually Don Mancini and a lot of these others that are really great about representation, for for whatever spectrum. I mean, one of the big ones you talked about, Mancini, is great on representing disability, but then also queer representation. It's one of those franchises that has been incredible with it. So obviously we got Freaks. You already mentioned Rain Man. What are some other of the best examples in history?
Oh gosh, best examples. That's really tough. I mean, Marlee Matlin's Children of a Lesser God, I think is worthy. She still is one of the few disabled women, the only disabled woman, as far as I know, deaf and disabled, to win an Oscar.
Yeah.
And it's one of those films that prioritizes deaf people of all stripes. And even though Bill Hurt is the lead, he's the one that opens the movie, nobody gives a shit about him. You only care about Marlee Matlin. She is so good in it. She's so magnetic. And she really is a person that sends up this character, challenges him all the time for his own kind of ableist microaggressions that he exhibits. And I mean, off screen, he was a horrible human being to her. So, but I think that one's one I really appreciate. Coming Home from 1976 is probably my favorite, just because it's a pre-ADA world, and Hal Ashby was very forthright about trying to show what disabled people, disabled veterans were dealing with. And I know Jon Voight is a horrific human being now, but he is so damn good. It makes me mad that he's a horrific human being now because he's so good in the movie.
Right.
He gets a lot of the little bits of business right. He wheels a wheelchair accurately. He's a good looking guy that's got a car and a house, emphasizing again that disabled people just live lives. It's a brilliant, brilliant film. It's got a disabled sex scene in it that I think is very, just beautifully rendered. That one's definitely a high point. And Best Years of Our Lives, I think, from 1946 is another one. Harold Russell won the Oscar, won two. And it's one of those films that really does, again, the veteran element is there, but also just gets a lot of the little minutia, well, and Harold Russell's great.
I want to say thank you because you keep bringing up all the things that I'm planning on asking, that you're just making these transitions incredible. Do you feel like the ADA had a tangible effect on filmmaking at the time where, other than the actual making of the film, they were required to do certain things on these working spaces, but like how they were represented on screen after the ADA as opposed to before?
The ADA comes in the 90s officially, and I think it's interesting to watch something like a movie that comes pre-ADA is Coming Home. 1976. You're seeing how so many of the places that Jon Voight's character goes to have stairs, or he's got to, kind of navigate. He goes to a police station at one point and there's a stair. He's got to go off with his wheelchair. It's everywhere because that was what the world looked like. Yep. And then you see something post ADA. I can always tell when it's post ADA, even if it's set in a previous time period. Something like, Born on the 4th of July, which actually came out right as the ADA passes. And it's very much a post, kind of ADA world where you're not really looking at the sidewalks. Right. And it's more about this character trying to accept his own disability in himself. But then you watch something like Forrest Gump, which again set in the 1960s during Vietnam. And, you look at the medical system pre and post ADA in these films. And in Coming Home, they're very apathetic, doctors. Everybody's kind of living on the dole. They don't really know how to handle money. Born on the 4th of July is just the medical system is hell, Ron Kovic's screaming into the void. There's people dying all around him. There's doctors that don't speak English. Right. Whereas then you look at something like Forrest Gump, which I always laugh because there's a scene where Lieutenant Dan goes down a ramp and the joke is you hear him crash into something.
He's going too fast, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm just that would not have been a ramp in 1970 whatever. That would have been a staircase. Stop it. But even, something I just, you can tell kind of this post-ADA world where the hospitals in Vietnam, it's all doctors that speak English.
Right.
You know, everybody's got their own bed. They got ice cream and ping pong. It's just great, right? Everything was cool. So there's a real revision of history once the ADA passes, and especially with war films. You know, but when you get the ADA, you get into the war in Iraq. You know, in the 2000s, it wasn't enough to just have about physical disabilities. You have to deal with mental disabilities as well. And you're also seeing a lot more of the military and medical system paying, or at least offering funds, you know, to be part of the movie. So yeah.
That's a soft spot for certain people in Hollywood, of course, but it obviously leaves a bad taste in the mouth afterwards, especially when it's propaganda of all different shapes and sizes.
You know, I included Home of the Brave. I was looking for a war movie that had a disabled woman in it, and I had a friend recommend this movie to me, and I watched it. And Home of the Brave is very 2006. It's very much slow-mo, black and brown people throwing bombs, death to America type of thing. Very 2000s war in Iraq, like us versus them. But Jessica Biel plays the leading lady. She loses a hand in a hand and an arm in a bombing. And it's one of the most laughably heinous disabled movies I'd watched in a minute. She goes to Walter Reed. Okay, they make a big point of saying like Walter Reed Medical Center, and they're showing her all these high-end things we can do with your hand, and they're like, I forget if they say like her insurance doesn't cover any of that or what the excuse was, but they're like, here's what you get, and it's like a rubber glove that looks like a hand. It looks fake as hell. And she goes to like use it, like she's a PE teacher and they throw the volleyball at her and she drops it because she's like, and she has flashbacks. I'm not kidding. Slow-mo flashbacks of her just like playing tennis with her perfect arm and like going to the grocery store and throwing her arms up in the air. And you're just like, I can see what is going on here. You really miss your arm. She's got a boyfriend that she, you know, can't deal with what has happened to her, and her boyfriend leaves her. And he says, well, I guess it only takes one good hand to push someone away. And I'm like,
Jesus.
I'm like, okay, this was a movie that got money. And I think they said, I forget if Irwin Winkler, I think, was the producer, very old Hollywood. And I think they said that it was meant to be a modernized version of Best Years of Our Lives. And I was like, yes, if somebody did not learn anything from Best Years of Our Lives.
Yikes.
It's over, Ray. It's over. Don't you get it?
What did I do? At least tell me that. What did I do?
It's not about you, it's about me.
Okay. You want to be alone? Fine. I've tried comforting you. I've tried giving you space. But you were just so damn determined to be pissed off at the world. Guess it only takes one good hand to push people away. Take care of yourself, Vanessa.
That's not great. At the beginning, one of the things that you mentioned was that as a critic, there are not many other people in this space or any other people in this space. Maybe a sensitive question to ask. So if you don't want me to include it, say the word. But are there any organizations that you can feel are really pressing forward to make that a priority to be inclusive in this space?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to journalism, no. You know, there's a lot of disabled organizations that, you know, look at the film industry, you know, and want to change how movies get made. But when it comes to, you know, disabled journalism, I get a lot of students that email me and say, when I Google disabled journalist, not even disabled entertainment journalist, when I Googled disabled journalist, your name came up. And it's only getting worse right now, you know, with the way the economy is going, and journalism is kind of dying on the vine. You know, people are not hiring marginalized, you know, writers. Right. It's kind of going back to the bad old days where it was, unless you were a white man and abled, you know, you weren't going to get hired. So I'm not hearing a lot about disabled journalists, you know, being in the room. I have left my current trade job, and I get a lot of people that say, could you get this, you know, in front of somebody at the Hollywood Reporter or Variety or, my old, locations that I worked at, IndieWire, The Wrap. And, I say, well, I don't work there anymore. I can recommend somebody write about this, but, if they're not well-versed, do you really want them to? And, right now, so it's unfortunate. I worry about how much disabled organizations that are trying to just change the film world are going to struggle because there are no disabled journalists willing and able, and there's not enough time from abled allies who, are overburdened and understaffed, how much of disabled coverage is going to kind of fall through the cracks.
Yeah, and it's not just journalism. That's the hard part right now because, specific rights are being stripped from all kinds of minorities, including the disabled. And depending on how we respond to that, just like you just mentioned the word overwhelmed, and the reality is while we're watching all kinds of people lose their rights, some of these are just going to be gone, most likely. Yeah,
and I think that's the thing, it's something that really irks me because there is disabled content being made. We're getting a Judy Heumann biopic next year from Apple TV. There's some fantastic documentaries that are coming out, about disabled advocates and disabled issues. And I get a lot of people that email me and they're like, can you write about this? Can you cover this? I don't want to be the only person covering disabled content, nor should I. I don't represent, I know that there are other critics that have other opinions that are better than me. But at the same time, I do worry about what the next generation of disabled critics disabled entertainment writers look like, especially in a landscape where it's all about social media and quick bites and no nuance and saying, your point quickly. It's troubling. But I keep on, I've been kind of pointing out things that have irked me. We've had 2 big disabled events. We had Wicked last year. We had Deaf President Now that came out this year. We had a Marlee Matlin documentary that came out this year, none of which prioritize disabled journalists or writers or even influencers, writing about covering those elements. So my big cause celeb at the moment is, how do you expect, people to talk about disability if you're not going to let disabled journalists have a crack at the few things that are actually made for us, and I've had people say, are you just complaining that you aren't asked? At this point, I would be happy to see anybody asked. When Wicked came out, I remember, I tried to get an interview with Marissa Bodie to talk to her about, playing the character, and I didn't get it, which was fine. But when I asked, I want to be an ally for other disabled writers that have maybe talked to her, that have maybe written about this. A lot of people, said that they had put in requests and been denied or had to write stuff for their own sites because no one wanted it. It's very frustrating because, if you don't want an able journalist to kind of get egg on their face by saying something wrong, then maybe hire a disabled journalist to cover that topic.
It happens so few and far between that I feel like we applaud the simplest of things and never prioritize the things that are actually going to be leading to market change. Last year was a big example. Representation of sex workers. Honora got multiple screenings of Sean just bringing sex workers to watch a movie together, which is great. I'm glad that we're showing it in a positive light, and that's fantastic. But what about people covering the film that are talking about things like that more, or films like Coda that could actually focus on those things in a positive light and how it can affect the community? It's something that gets lost very quickly.
It's very frustrating. And I think that, when I was an editor, I got asked a lot at the places I worked at, well, you're disabled, so you're part of the marginalized community, and I'm like, yes, but that doesn't mean that if there's a film or a TV show by a Black filmmaker, you should automatically give it to me because I'm disabled. Right. Those two things do not parse. And I made a point to try to, when I knew that, no one like me or anybody on my staff could have that experience, I would try to find those writers and give them an opportunity. And eventually I got told, it takes too much time, and we don't have the bandwidth, and also it's expensive, so just you guys should do it. You don't need lived experience in order to write about something. And I'm like, true, but again, I want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So it's frustrating, and I think that we're seeing kind of the down. It's why I think people are so, gravitating to Substack and stuff like that, because, I know that for me, at least in my case, it's letting me be the writer that I want to be, and hopefully one day we'll be able to bring on more writers and kind of be the editor that's like, you should be covering these things. People should be talking about these things.
And that's where what you just brought up with like marginalized communities is so important, because it's not just a matter of we can only focus on one. It's a matter of there are films with diverse casts that we need to cover certain things and focus on different things, because people are experiencing those films in different ways. Yeah.
I mean, when How to Train Your Dragon, the remake came out, I had friends that were going to the press event, and I asked more than one of them, can you ask about, the disabled representation and about, the fact that Hiccup is disabled, and the end of the movie where, the character exhibits limb loss and, kind of working with that. And I had more than one of them say, well, that's a really interesting question. Like, I don't want to make anybody uncomfortable, so I don't feel I should ask that. And I was like, right, but I didn't get invited, and neither did any disabled person. So it's kind of on you, if you want to kind of lead the charge and help make the world a better place. So it's frustrating. And I think that's the other thing too, is that people don't want to ask the tough questions, especially in entertainment journalism, that could limit their access. I interviewed Ari Aster one time, and I had to ask him at the end. I'm like, what draws you to want to use disabled characters in your movies? And he looked at me like I had sprouted a second head. He did not know what to say. He had never been asked that in his life, and he gave me a word salad. This was when Midsommar came out. He gave me a word salad about like eugenics in Sweden at the time, and I was just like, okay. And then he was like, well, I don't think I use disabled characters in everything. You don't know that the character in Hereditary was disabled. And I was like, right, we don't know that she's overtly disabled, but, Millie Shapiro is a disabled actress, and, the character is heavily coded as being mentally delayed. So, like, and they were very happy when it was like, okay, you're done, go out. And I think that's the thing, is it's always funny to me. I don't like to be the person that calls people to the carpet, but at the same time, I'm just like, well, no one's going to ask you this. And it's kind of my thing. I mean, on the flip side of that, I interviewed Kevin Smith once and, asked him about, and I included the movie in my book because I still think I enjoy it. I asked him about casting Trishelle Edmonds, who is a black deaf actress in the Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back sequel. And he looked at me like I had sprouted a second head, but it was a good one because he was very happy that somebody had thought to ask him about that. He's all, no one's brought the character up. No one's asked me about, that. He had a great story about, initially he wanted a deaf, black, trans actress, but he couldn't find somebody who was all three, so he just kind of, cast her that way, and, talked about how his daughter learned ASL so that she could, sign. And it was a really great story. And he said afterwards, he's like, thank you. Like, no one's praised her performance, and talked about the significance of having a character like that. And I'm like, it's just, when I see it, I gotta ask about it. So, I mean, there are some creatives that want to talk about it. It's just there's not enough disabled people to ask, and the able people are too scared to ask.
It's also extra frustrating when we've seen the expansion of like covering of queer representation. I mean, 40 years ago, we were having the same discussion about, well, we can't have that even in this film, let alone like discussing it in the interviews after. And now not everybody, but most of us are viewing this as just sort of everyday life. And we've won a lot of that victory.
I mean, I've said that, you know, the disabled experience is analogous. You know, I think the Black community, the LGBTQ community, the Indigenous community, we all have kind of the same issues when it comes to representation as regards to lack of it and, you know, the ism part of it, you know, whether that's racism, whether that's, you know, homophobia, whether that's ableism, but our issues are not the same. You know, they're analogous, they're similar, but there's an entire history of Black representation that is completely different than what disabled people have experienced. At the same time, you know, we're in our infancy, you know, in terms of film representation. It took how many years, you know, for racism to be something that people point out and say like, oh, we shouldn't do that. It could take just as long time for, you know, disabled representation to get better, but it's the impetus is still on the disabled people. And that's unfortunately not helpful right now, you know, because if you're waiting for disabled filmmakers and disabled screenwriters, you're going to be waiting a while because you need the studios to want to greenlight that content. And right now, you know, they don't care about it. So they're not going to greenlight it.
That's too true. Gosh, yeah, there's so much into this that I would love to go into. Your previous work, tell us about, but have you read the book? Yeah,
so that was my first book. It seems so long ago because I've been writing books for way too long right now. I don't recommend writing 3 books in like a year and a half. Never do it. It's awful. But it's about literary adaptations. I did 52 books, 52 movies, and kind of comparing and contrasting how they jive or don't jive with the source material. And it was a lot of fun. You know, I say the silver lining to a pandemic was that I had a lot of free time on my hands. So I could just watch movies and read the book and kind of, it made me feel like, okay, I could probably do my master's if I wanted to, because it was very similar thought process of like, churning out books and being able to like sum up your points. And it's been great. It's been great to see people that have said, you know, that they read the book and they watch the movie. They have book clubs. And I'm just sent in volume 2. It's going to be about romance adaptations, which was very different for me as somebody that does not tend to look at books as romantic books. So it was a nice little challenge. And yeah, it's very cool to have. I guess does 2 books make a franchise? I don't know. I think it does. I feel like that's very cool to have a series.
That is pretty damn cool. One of the things that has been very funny to me after our chance meeting, which I don't even remember exactly what happened. I posted something on Twitter and you responded to it, and I don't even remember what that was. Do you remember what it was?
Was it the Rain Man coming out?
Probably.
I think it might have been Rain Man coming out, and I think I snarkily added, "There's no autistic representation or any autism discussion to show how this is still not dated."
Right. So since that moment, I went, okay, I have to speak to her as somebody that's a father of 2 kids with autism and ADHD myself, and I'm you know, going down the disabled path because I have screwed up my foot many times in my life and lots of other things happening. I went, I'm so just invested in finding out what this woman is feeling and believing. That led me to discovering your podcast, and I feel like over the last 2 weeks, the word ticklish doesn't exist as a real word to me anymore. Tell me about your podcast, because I think other people need to hear this.
Yeah, I mean, Ticklish Business started. It started as a blog because I spent so much time reviewing contemporary film that I really wanted to review, you know, older film stuff that wasn't new to me, kind of like give me a little something different. And it was right as classic film was not, you know, there was a classic film community, but it was mostly like relegated to Twitter back when Twitter was still fun. And Facebook. Twitter, yeah, exactly. I discovered the TCM party hashtag and I made all these friends, and the blog became less about like just anything that was old and more anything that was like pre-1970s studio era. And then I figured, I'll start a podcast, and podcasts were established, but they weren't glutted yet. And there was as far as I knew at the time when I started it 8 years ago, there were not any classic film podcasts. Karina Longworth had not started You Must Remember This, which, funnily enough, I always say Karina Longworth and I are in an imaginary feud. She just doesn't know it. My same initial nemesis. No, Karina's great. She's been on the podcast before. And I think I brought that up to her, and she's just like, oh, okay. But I decided I wanted to do a podcast, about old Hollywood and kind of share the knowledge that I had learned from reading and watching these movies. And I kind of always envisioned it as like a TCM intro with two people that was, kind of more off the cuff. And we're still doing it 8 years later. I didn't even think we would still be doing it. I took a little hiatus at the end of last year to finish my book. And we're back to doing it bi-weekly. We have a new episode coming out soon. We have an episode on Dangerous When Wet about Esther Williams. We did a Jaws episode. Only took us 8 years to finally talk about Jaws. We're going to do this as Spinal Tap in a couple weeks. That's going to be really fun. And it's just been really cool to not only get to go to like the TCM Film Festival and hang out, but interview, Paul Feig and talk about what he loves about classic film. And, we interviewed some old Hollywood celebs like Haley Mills and Nancy Olson and the late Ed Asner. So it's always been cool. And when we do that, they're always like, you're so young. Why do you young people want to talk about things? Which I always laugh about now because I see a lot of younger people in their 20s talking about old Hollywood. And I'm like, I remember when I was the young whippersnapper that, now I'm not young anymore. And now it's you guys. It also reminds me painfully of age. So it's great to see how time has passed there.
That is sadly true. One of the big things about the podcast I want to throw out there is you have gotten some absolutely insane guests over the years. You have quite a resume there. Some that I were impressed by, and I will let other people discover those on their own. But one I really want to throw out, dear friend of mine that I look up to and was great on your show is Alonso Duralde, who last year just wrote just this incredible book on queer history and cinema, like we kind of been talking about. Hollywood Pride is a great book. Alonso's fantastic. But, I mean, Eddie Muller, some of these other people that I've looked up to for years, like you have done some incredible work. So just well done.
Thank you. I did a conference recently here in LA with Ben Mankiewicz, and somebody brought up that Eddie Muller did the podcast, and he was like, I don't want to hear about Eddie. I'm like, well, you didn't come on the podcast, so you're the only host that hasn't done it, so I'm not really sure what your hang up is. So...
Well, to finish this off, a lot of people that maybe started this conversation not super excited about disability representation. Tell me about Welcome Boils and Ghouls, because man, I am so excited about this. Like I'd never heard about this before I started researching you, but I will have to pre-order this day one too.
Yeah, so that was, I maintain that I will probably never have an idea as great as that ever again. That was the lightning rod idea. I'm friends with Alan Katz, who was one of the showrunners on the series, and it all kind of had started. I was very fascinated in the rights issues and why the show was not streaming, and I wanted to write an article about it. And my editor was just kind of like, yeah, nobody cares. So let's not do that. And I was like, fine. But I had become friendly with Alan, and, Alan enjoyed telling stories about working on the show. And so, he was very fascinated by my book writing. And he's like, well, what's the next book? What are you going to do next? And I was like, I don't know. Like, I got to figure something that I can live with for like a year, something that I can really like not be just bored with. I'm like, and it's, Olsen twins biography, which would probably be really hard because, they're the Olsen twins. I'm like, or, maybe I could write about Tales from the Crypt. Like we could do like an oral history. I'm like, but somebody's done that, right? And he's like, nope. And I'm like, wait, what? And he's like, no one's ever talked to. And I had found out that there was only one book that had ever been written about the show, was in 1996. And it was really more of kind of like a picture heavy overall look at the series right as it was ending. And it had very limited scope. It was very rose-colored glasses, very Joel Silver heavy. It's a great book. It's been a fantastic resource, but it was far from the full excuse me, full story. And I could see the title just like, you know, that part in Boogie Nights when Dirk Diggler just has that moment where he sees his name and the lights, the sparklers are going off. That's what I saw. And we sold it very, very quickly. My publisher was very excited about it. And that's what I've been working on. I was supposed to have it done earlier, but the TCM wanting a second volume of my book kind of made me move it.
Right.
But it's been utterly bananas to think of, you know, I've talked to over 150 people from all facets of the show. I wish I had more. There's several people I wish I had that as of right now I do not, and I probably won't. But to hear the stories of how the show came to be and who almost did it and why it ended and, you know, the films, I mean, it's comprehensive, right? As of right now, I'm at the stage where I'm kind of like organizing everything, and I looked at my page count and I was like, I really need to ask my editor, like, how far over the word count am I allowed to go before I got to start paring it down? So it's very cool. I always worry that I don't have enough story, and I look at that word count and I'm like, no, I think I do. So it's gonna be really cool to put it out there, and I hope that by the time it's out there, the show will be streaming. My fingers are crossed. I'm hopeful. So 2027, it's going to be very cool.
I have longed for years to see it restored, like from the original, what we can get from the negatives, and then edit it again, because obviously shot on film, edited on tape is very difficult to maneuver around in the restoration world. So I hope somebody that's independently wealthy loves the show.
From what I've heard, you know, the digitization is pretty good. You know, the donors are the ones that are in charge of the rights, you know, right now. So we know that they're doing good these days. So, you know, I've been fortunate to talk to them about this, and, you know, the show seems to be in good hands. The hope is that, you know, somebody will want to stream it, and I'm very hopeful that's going to happen. So, and I know that there's been a lot of really good illicit 4K transfers on YouTube of the series, so I'm hopeful that, you know, it'll look really good. But I mean, also I'm of the fact that, like, I love that it looks non-HD. You know, I know when I interviewed Todd Masters, who is the VFX makeup guy for the series, you know, he said he's all, you know, HD is going to ruin everything. He's all, because you're going to see every little seam, every little, you know, makeup. He's like, the point was we could make it look a little shitty because it wasn't going to be, you know, ultra blown up. So it'll be interesting to see when that happens.
I fully agree. Links for the books, the website, everything is in the description below. Where are you most active that you want people to follow you?
I am on all the social medias. You can find me on Blue Sky and TikTok, Blue Sky, TikTok, and Twitter at Kristen K. Lopez. And you can find me at Instagram at Kristen Lopez 88. And that's because I couldn't change it to Kristen K. Lopez. So this is where we're at. So you can find me there. I have my Substack, The Film Maven, which is thefilmmaven.substack.com, where I go log on all sorts of stuff. Ticklish Business is wherever you get podcasts. We have a very active Patreon. We just did an episode on a review on My Mom Jane, the Jay Mansfield documentary, and we're doing a new mini-series looking at contemporary-ish movies that have classic film vibes, and we're going to be kicking that off with A League of Their Own. So yeah, That's at patreon.com/ticklishbiz.
All those links in the description below. Kristen, this has been incredible. Thanks for coming on here to talk about it. It's something that I want to be somebody that can share voices like this. I
appreciate it. And I mean, when the book is out in November, I'm happy to come back and share more once people have actually read the book.
Appreciate it. Have a good one, and we'll talk to you hopefully again soon. Thank you for listening to the Disconnected Podcast. There's one big thing that you could do to help the show, and that is to leave a rating and review on the podcast service of your choice. Thank you.
Hello!
This is Matt.
And Emily from Scarecrow Video in Seattle, Washington. Did you know that we have the largest video collection in the world? We have over 146,000 titles and growing. That's over 3 times more than Netflix, Amazon, Max, and Hulu combined.
Plus, Scarecrow now offers rent-by-mail service throughout the U.S., so check out scarecrowvideo.org for details. You can catch Emily and I, or Matt and I, if that was going to be you saying that, on our bi-weekly YouTube show, Viva Physical Media, for video recommendations and so much more.
See ya!
Bye!
Thank you for listening. To hear more shows from the Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network, please select the link in the description